Well, alright then, here we go. Here's a video about the moment that got me into the almighty Sumac, and I expect might have done the same for you, or might have the potential to do the same for you. I'm talking about that first sludgy riff in Image of Control from the masterpiece What One Becomes. This punishing, slippery riff is really great and feels like one of the heaviest, most satisfying things in the world to me. I think there are a few reasons for that. The first academic thing I published was about how one aspect of heaviness can be rhythmic difficulty, because difficulty is metaphorically linked with largeness and seriousness in the same way that the metaphor of heaviness is. This riff certainly has its share of rhythmic difficulty, which, combined with the other stuff that seems to generally contribute to heaviness, so lots of low end in the sound, a certain type of distortion, seriousness in the band's image, makes this a very heavy riff. But I also said it's very satisfying, which has to do, kind of by definition, with how it plays with my expectations. This riff comes after almost 4 minutes of music without words or a pulse. It's one of these very cool group improvisations that Sumac has explored more and more on their albums. But because it's a metal album, we probably expect this to turn into riffs. Plenty of metal albums start with things that aren't riffs, whether it's a sample, or a passage on different instruments, or a clean section in a different style, or what have you, if you will, and so forth and so on. In Image of Control, as this free improvised intro stretches on for maybe an unusually long time, I tend to get even more anxious or antsy for the moment when we'll get a riff, especially after the first time I had listened to it and I knew what sort of monster was on its way. So there's the satisfaction of this one type of expectation baked into a lot of metal, where we get a transition from the solo free rhythm part that comes right before this riff to something that is certainly a riff. As a side note, if you're noticing some looseness about what a riff might mean on this channel, that's how language, especially informal language about music, works, baby. It means whatever I want it to within some limitations, and you'll hopefully know what I mean by it anytime I use it. But what's really cool is that the satisfaction actually gets stretched out even further, because as we find out with our ears, this riff is pretty firmly centered on B minor. But we don't get that big B minor chord resolution right away. Instead, when everything comes in, we hang out roughly on an F#7 chord for a bit, which makes me feel like it's dragging out that really satisfying moment just a little longer. In other words, we have a kind of textural resolution, which is this moment where we switch from free rhythm solo guitar to a full band riff. And then we also have this harmonic resolution where we go from F#7 to B minor. In a more boring world, maybe we'd get these two resolutions at the same time. But luckily we're in this world, and we get this more subtle version that stretches out the resolution slightly and makes it so much cooler, in my opinion. Let's talk about this riff for just a sec. That seems like an appropriate thing to do on this channel, I guess. It's a repeating pattern that has a few jagged edges, and I find it to be a little slippery. So let's talk about why that might be. It doesn't do anything super weird. It's all eighth notes and quarter notes and 16th notes, all at one tempo, and the whole riff does repeat a few times. So we can rule out a few things that might in some other riffs make things a rhythmic slip and slide. But this has a few other things that are tricky. I'm going to talk about just one of them, which is that parts of the riff have clear metric characteristics, and this forces us to change how we're hearing the meter. Allow me to explain. This riff is mostly in 3/4, and there's a clear part of the riff that tends to correspond with the downbeat, which is those two quarter notes that are reinforced in all the instruments. Hudson's dissertation has some very cool stuff about how a given riff can have its own metric profile in addition to what we bring ourselves or get from the drums. That's kind of what I'm getting at here. We could have a boringer riff where this always comes on what feels like the downbeat of the 3/4. Maybe that would be something like this. Instead, what we have is, of course, cooler. There are interruptions that don't last for full measures of 3/4, so that when we get to those two quarter notes again, there's some metric dissonance. On the one hand, we've learned that those quarter notes say this is the start of a measure of 3/4. While if we try even a little bit to follow the meter through these interruptions, we'll find that they show up, that these quarter note downbeats or downbeats show up at points that aren't the start of 3/4 measures if we try to keep that meter going. That sentence was kind of a mess, but hopefully this analytical animation will make it clearer. So the actual riff is like this. This is an enormously useful compositional resource that's really pretty simple. Sometimes it's slipperier to reuse the same motivic cell, even in a recognizable metric context, and then throw in a few little curveballs like this. The feeling here in a lot of Sumac's riffs reminds me a bit of that lurching feeling I was trying to describe in my Confessor video. The trick in both types of music is not that there's a bunch of different stuff going on, though that can be cool and disorienting, of course, but that there's a pretty small collection of motivic materials that's tweaked and mix and matched enough that it becomes surprisingly hard to get a hold of. Let's listen to this whole section, which, and I can't stress this enough, is one of my favorite passages of music ever. Yeah, that's the stuff. See ya.